Scary EIRE. EIRE is the Irish or Gaelic word for Ireland. Paranormal means all the things that are impossible to explain by known natural forces or by science. And Ireland is steeped in lore, ghosts, blood, sweat, tears, sacrifice, hunger, desperation, and charm. Oh, and the paranormal. Welcome to Scary EIRE.
Mark Manning.
I surrender, dear. Oh, do put that away. You'll have someone's eye out. Hello and welcome to this edition of Scary EIRE. We've just had a big storm in Ireland. I've heard it called Storm EOWYN, Storm EOWYN, whatever. It was big. January 24th, just gone. Shortly we'll be getting on the telephone to discuss with a man originally from Birmingham, England, the aftermath of aforementioned storm.
But before we do,
I want to tell you that later on we'll be discussing, no tittering in the cheap seats, the big wind of 1839, Ireland's most dramatic and explosive storm-stroke-hurricane of all time. You're gonna love it. Now, if you are listening to Scary EIRE, I would like your participation, please. I'm like a lonely child waiting by the phone, in the words of Duran Duran. Well, email to be precise. If you've got a ghostly tale, email it to me. paranormalireland@protonmail.com. Again,
paranormalireland@protonmail.com.
Right, where's me phone, Den?
We're only making plans for Nigel.
how long ago is it now, Nigel, since you and your good lady settled in County Mayo, Ireland?
30 years this year, Mark. The end of this year.
And did you ever experience a storm as devastating as this one?
As devastating, no, but as bad. In 1998, I think it was St Stephen's Day, it was bad then as well. I just remember being out in it and it was really bad.
And were there any similar stormy travesties back in your time in England?
Nah, we never got storms like that in the Midlands, no.
It was as serious as a heart attack this time around because you had a red warning. Well, Nigel, were you making plans?
We knew it was coming this time, where about 25 years ago we didn't know it was coming, but this time we did, and we just look. You just move everything that can blow around out of the way, and you close everything down, and you shut all the doors and the gates, and you do things like that and hope for the best then.
For those that don't know, County Mayo is a rugged, raw, manly piece of the west of Ireland. I eat an onion for breakfast kind of place. I know I'm being a bit dramatic, but describe the terrain for people.
It's mountainy and hilly and about 2 miles away from the sea, so it's wild and rugged.
With the wild, unpredictable Atlantic at your doorstep. It's quite remote, really.
Yeah, it is quite remote, yeah.
But the scenery is spectacular, though, isn't it? It ranges from verdant to desert-like, and of course you've got those constant rocky cliffs. You're spoiled, really, aren't you?
It's nice on a sunny day, put it like that. On a wet, windy day, you just don't want to be if you know what I mean.
And so, you had 24 hours or so awaiting for the storm to come crashing.
did you lie awake waiting for it, or did it awake you?
No, it started like you get the quiet before the storm. The wind drops. There's no wind at all at first, and then it slowly builds up, and it did that in the evening time, and then it started to get gusty in the early hours, and I think it peaked about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, you see, just as it was getting light. But it's very noisy, and the wind's rolling across the roof like thunder, and you can hear things banging around, that's come loose or something like that. And I just got up when it got light, and I went out to see how bad it was. I was being blown about all over the place, and there was just trees smashed and down all over the place, everywhere on my neighbour's land, but there was no structural damage to our house, but he lost a few tiles.
And you're a farmer as well, aren't you, Nigel? Hopefully those lovely animals of yours were safe and sound.
Well, yeah, I mean, they know when the storm's coming, so they move a quiet place out of the wind, and usually they're okay, you know. You don't hear about animals getting hurt, unless they're kept in a small field, but usually you put them somewhere safe. It's mainly all sheep around here. Sheep could hide behind a rock or anything, but if they were out, if a sheep got caught in the middle of in a field in that kind of wind, it would have been blown away, like, you know, it would have soon disappeared.
Bah!
And got hurt. But they're quite clever. There's no such thing as a dumb animal, as they say.
And electricity-wise, how did you fare, Nigel? Because the outages were widespread.
We had no power from the Thursday night till Tuesday morning. We had a generator, so we were okay. So we could keep warm and have the freezer was kept okay, and we had warm drinks and meals. A lot of people didn't, so they had to move out of their homes because it was too cold, and they went into the towns and stopped in hotels. Because there was no services, there was no internet, and there was no power and no telephone and no water. We had no water at all. The hotels and the businesses which were open would only accept cash. So if you had a card or a phone to pay, you were turned away because there was just no way they could stick a payment, you see. So cash was king.
And the irony is you hear so much about, you know, the cashless society. And here we are back to basics. Wouldn't surprise me if there was difficulties with electric vehicles as well.
Because how would you charge your electric vehicle? You're stuck. If we've got petrol or diesel, we can drive anywhere to try and find food or water or safety. People with electric vehicles, you've only got so much power stored on it and you can't charge it back up. Also, an electric power tool is completely useless because you can't charge that. So a petrol chainsaw can cut a tree out of the way, which is blocking your drive or blocking the road, but an electric one won't do that. It'll go flat and then it becomes totally useless. The proof is in the pudding. All this talk about going electric and going, you know, all digital, it's total rubbish, and the storm proves that it just doesn't work.
Well, thankfully all's well that ends well, so hopefully you and the missus are okay, yeah?
Well, I think so, yeah. I mean, we've only got the phones back today after I don't know how many days, but the power's back now, the water's back, and the internet's working again. So we were going to bed at 7 o'clock in the evening because we're just sitting there looking at each other, nothing to watch or do, you see, so that's what we were doing.
Well, on the plus side, Nigel, you're not going to be short of firewood for some time. You were also telling me you had something like 20 trees blown down around you, and some of them pretty old.
Yeah, there were some really old oaks, about 200 years old. We lost 2 of those at least, and there's lots of other trees come down as well and smashed to pieces. Then, you know, branches get torn off and one tree falls on top of another and all that kind of thing, you see.
Oh, old son, you've really been through the wars. You are going to be in lumberjack mode for some time. You're going to be chopping and chopping. Well, Nigel, congratulations for weathering the storm in County Mayo on Ireland's west coast. Please give my best to your good lady as well, and thank you for joining us here on Scary EIRE.
Okay, Mark, see ya.
Yeah, a couple of things over the years, but I've learned, well, I suppose it's not learned, I've just become accustomed to it, and I think it's kind of, it's maybe another sense or something. But often when you go into places, you'll get a feeling for the place, and you'll get a feeling of whether or not it's comfortable. And whatever causes that, who knows what causes that, but we have an intuition, we have an inbuilt intuition. I can't describe what it is or where it comes from or the physics of it or the chemistry of it, but it's there, and anybody will tell you to stick with your intuition. If you think something doesn't feel right, then don't hang around.
Superb advice from regular contributor to Scary EIRE, David McGlynn, aka the Squire. And don't hang around either. If you've got an Irish paranormal tale to tell, simply email paranormalireland@protonmail.com and it'll be read out for you. Or you get to tell it on air yourself. That's paranormalireland@protonmail.com.
Earlier this year, I reached out to the exotically named Turtle Bunbury. He's an Irish historian and author. And I said, Turtle, I said to him, my late mother used to tell me her grandparents related a story to her. It was like a hurricane, a huge big storm that happened in Ireland years and years and years ago. Do you remember anything about it? And unlike his name, Turtle was very quick on the uptake. He said to me, Mark, I've just the thing for you. You can read all about it on turtlebunbury.com. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing for you folks. So gather round the campfire, get your marshmallows. or else a dirty great lump of toast on the end of a stick. 'Cause here we go. Oh, it doesn't have to be all ghosts and ghoulies and leprechauns to be scary, you know. The elements are just as terrifying in dear old Ireland town. The night of the big wind was the most devastating storm in recorded Irish history. The hurricane of 6th to 7th of January 1839 made more people homeless in a single night than all the sorry decades of eviction that followed it. The calm before the big wind struck was particularly eerie. Most of the 8 million people living in Ireland at the time were preparing for Little Christmas, the Feast of the Epiphany. The previous day had seen the first snowfall of the year, heavy enough for some to build snowmen. By contrast, Sunday morning was unusually warm, almost clammy, and yet the air was so still that, along the west coast, voices could be heard floating on the air between houses more than a mile apart. Notwithstanding the snow, the day was not cold, recalled Thomas O'Neill Russell, who was on his family farm near Moat, County Westmeath, when the storm blew in. There was not even a breath of wind, but there was something awful in the dark stillness of that winter day, for there was no sunlight coming through the thick, motionless clouds that hung over the earth. At approximately 3 p.m., the rain began to fall and the wind picked up. Nobody could have predicted that those first soft raindrops signified an advance assault from the most terrifying hurricane in human memory. By 6 p.m., the winds had become strong and the raindrops were heavier, sleet-like, with occasional bursts of hail. Farmers grimaced as their hayricks and thatched roofs took a pounding. In the towns and villages, fires flickered and doors slammed. Church bells chimed and dogs began to whine. Fishermen turned their ears west. A distant, increasingly loud rumble could be heard upon the frothy horizon. At Glen O'Sheen in County Limerick, a well-to-do German farmer called Jacob Stoffel began to weep. At Moydrum Castle in County Westmeath, 78-year-old Lord Castlemaine decided to turn in early and go to bed. In the Wicklow Mountains, a team of geographic surveyors headed up by John O'Donovan finally made it to their hotel in Glendalough. They had been walking all day, often knee-deep in snow. Sailing upon the Irish Sea, Captain Smith of the Pennsylvania studied his instruments and tried to make sense of the fluctuating pressures. Rounding the north coast of Ireland in the schooner Venus, Master McPhee decided his best course of action would be to drop anchor in Rathmullen rather than risk his cargo of whiskey and sugar. All going to plan, he could complete the voyage from Glasgow to Sligo in the morrow. By 10 p.m., Ireland was in the throes of a ferocious cyclone that would continue unabated through the night for at least 8 hours. The hurricane had soared across 3,000 miles of unbroken, island-free Atlantic Ocean, gathering momentum every second. It hit Ireland's west coast with such power that the waves are said to have broken over the top of the cliffs of Moher. Reading contemporary accounts, the impression is that if Ireland did not have such magnificent cliffs forming a barrier along our west coast, the entire country would simply have been engulfed by water. The noise of the sea crashing against the rocks could be heard for miles inland. Above the roar and din of the storm itself, the earth trembled under the assault. The ocean tossed huge boulders onto the cliff tops of the Aran Islands. Perhaps the most distressing aspect was that all this took place in utter darkness. People cannot have known what was going on. The wind churned its way across the land. extinguishing every candle and lantern it encountered. The black night was only relieved by the lightning streaks that accompanied the storm and the occasional blood-red flicker of the aurora borealis burning in the northern sky. All across Ireland, hundreds of thousands of people were attuned to the sound of the furious tempest, their windows shattered by hailstones, their brick walls rattling, their rain-sodden thatched roofs sinking fast. The most terrible thing I have ever heard was the roaring of the wind on that awful night, stated T.O. Russell. I can never forget it, nor can anyone who heard it ever forget it. A horrible sound, something between a howl and a roar, of unutterable awfulness. It was hardly to be wondered at that almost everyone thought the end of the world had come. Those who had probably never felt fear in all their previous lives were like babies and wept like them. As the wind grew stronger, it began to rip the roofs off houses, chimney pots, broken slates, sheets of lead and shards of glass were hurtled to the ground. Rather astonishingly, someone later produced a statistic that 4,846 chimneys were knocked off their perches during the Night of the Big Wind. Many of those who died that night were killed by falling masonry. Norman tower houses and old churches collapsed. Factories and barracks were destroyed. Fires erupted in the streets of Castlebar, Athlone, Loughrea, Kells, Kilkenny, Moat and Dublin. The wind blew all the water out of the canal near Tuam. It knocked a pinnacle off Carlow Cathedral and the solitary remaining chimney off Carlow Castle. The north gable collapsed on the keep at Trim Castle. A gable also tumbled from the Bishop's Palace on the Rock of Cashel. Its remains can still be seen on the Great Lawn. It stripped the earth alongside the River Boyne, exposing the bones of soldiers killed in the famous battle 150 years earlier. Fish were lifted from the lake at Farnham, County Cavan, and scattered across the fields of Farnham Estate. Hundreds of fish were likewise reported to have been blown out of Lough Ree and died upon its shore. Others were washed ashore at Warren Point. Stories would later be told of sea fish found in the Slieve Blooms. A stormy petrel seabird was blown so far off course it was found at the Tuitt family estate near Sonna, West Meath, at 4 o'clock in the morning. Astor McPhee of the Venus stood horrified on board his ship as it was dragged from its anchorage in Rathmullen and pulled towards the Inch Bar, a notorious sandbank at the mouth of Lough Swilly. The ship struck the bank with such force that she immediately filled with water and fell on her beam ends. In desperation, McPhee and his crew clung to the main rigging and waited. In the village of Castle Dawson, near the northwestern shore of Lough Neagh, the wind seemingly toppled a 60-foot obelisk erected by the celebrated Earl Bishop of Derry in 1795 to commemorate the virtues and benevolence of the descendants of Joshua Dawson, the spymaster and chief secretary for Ireland in the reign of Queen Anne. Roads in every parish became impassable. All along the Grand Canal, trees were pulled up by the roots and hurled across the water to the opposite bank. Thousands of timber cabins were destroyed. The wind blew under the half-doors and swept the burning embers up from their fireplaces through the chimney to the thatch roofs, spreading the fire to neighbouring thatch, if there was any. Surviving inhabitants had no choice but to flee into the pitch-black night in clothes that were presumably soon wholly drenched by the intense rains and snows that accompanied the cruel, piercing wind. Many sought shelter amid the hollows and hedges of the land. People in the Midlands found themselves drenched in sudden torrents of salt water that must have been carried on the tempest from the ocean. Farmers were hit particularly hard. Hayricks in the fields across Ireland were blown to pieces. Wooden fences and dry stone walls collapsed, allowing terrified livestock to run away. Sheep were blown off mountains or killed by tumbling rocks. Mr. Powell of County Clare lost 170 sheep that night. Cattle were reported to have simply frozen to death in the fields. The next morning, One of Jacob Stuffel's neighbours recalled seeing the distraught German standing high up on a hillock, looking with dismay at his haggard farm, his stacks having been swept out of existence. Suddenly, he raised his two hands, palms open, high over his head, and looking up at the sky, he roared in a voice that was heard far and wide.
"Oh, God Almighty, what did I ever do to you, and you should treat me in that way?"
Stuffel was not the only man who believed that the hurricane, occurring on the night of the Epiphany, was of divine origin. Many saw it as a warning that the day of judgment would soon be upon them. Some believed the Freemasons had unleashed the devil from the gates of hell. Others maintained that English fairies had invaded Ireland and forced the indigenous little people to disappear amid a ferocious whirlwind. Irish fairies, of course, are wingless and can only fly by calling up the Siada Cora, the magic whirlwinds. The well-to-do did not escape. Many mansions had their roofs stripped off. Lord Castlemaine was fastening his bedroom windows when the storm blew them open and hurled him so violently upon his back that he instantly expired. His brother-in-law, the Earl of Cloncarty, later reported the loss of nearly 20,000 trees on his estate at Ballinasloe. Similar figures came in from the other landed estates. Henry Bruin of Oak Park in Carlow declared that his woods were now as bold as the palm of my hand. At the Seaford estate in County Down, an estimated 60,000 trees were felled. The Marquess of Cunningham lost a third of his woods at Slane. The Lord Bishop of Meath's domain at Ardbracken House was likewise devastated. In County Monaghan, the beautiful plantation at Glasslough, now Castle Leslie, and at nearby Castle Shane had severely felt the force of the storm. The Lefroy family had just completed the Carriglass Manor in County Longford. All of the trees around the house fell down, utterly altering the architectural perspectives, although the estate carpenters working on site did manage to craft a fine dining room sideboard from a fallen oak. On 6th of January 1839, timber was a valuable commodity. 24 hours later, so many trees had fallen that it was virtually worthless. Unimagined numbers of wild birds were killed, their nesting places smashed, and there was little bird song that spring. On a road near Athlone, thousands of dead crows were found alongside a screen of trees. Crows all but vanished from Irish skies for several years afterwards. Jackdaws also seemed on the verge of extinction. In his hotel room in Glendalough, John O'Donovan was fortunate not to share Lord Castlemaine's fate. He was struggling with the shutters when a squall mighty as a thunderbolt propelled him across the room. When he viewed the damage next morning, he described it as if the entire country had been swept clean by some gigantic broom. In Naas, the destruction is awful, reported the Newry Examiner. Scarcely a house has escaped demolition. This report from the archives of the Dublin Metropolitan Police following the night of the Big Wind, January 6th, 1839. Persons killed, 2. Persons injured, 18. Houses blown down, 38. Houses partly blown down, 119. Houses completely unroofed, 243. Houses partly unroofed, 4,846. Chimneys blown down, 1,527. Windows blown in, 1,143. Panes of glass ascertained to be broken, 30,358. Note, this is supposed to be considerably less than the actual damage. Valuable trees blown down, 2,534. Miscellaneous damage not included in the above. Total amount of damage in monetary terms, £64,045. Dublin resembled a sacked city, the whirlwind of desolation spared neither building, tree nor shrub. The Liffey rose by several feet and overflowed the quay walls. The elms that graced the main thoroughfare of the Phoenix Park were completely levelled, as were the elms at the Royal Hospital, Kilmainham. At the Viceregal Lodge, now Oris on Uachtaráin, a tree crashed through the roof of the guard room where soldiers had been conversing just moments earlier. The trees on Leinster Lawn outside the present-day Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, were uprooted and scattered like prostrate giants on their Mother Earth. The back wall of the Guinness Brewery collapsed, killing 9 fine horses. A witness next morning described how the noble animals were stretched everywhere, as if sleeping, but with every bone crushed by the ponderous weight of the wall. Military sentry boxes were blown off their stands and scattered like atoms. A glass shop on Nassau Street became a heap of ruins. On Clare Street, a chimney collapsed on a woman who had just got into her bed, killing her instantly. Police stations and churches opened their doors for thousands of frightened citizens who brought their young and frail in for protection. Even churches could not be trusted on this night of Lucifer. The steeple of Irish Town Chapel caved in, and the bell from the spire of St. Patrick's Cathedral came down like a meteorite. Mercifully, nobody died in either instance. Phibsborough Road was a bomb site of exploded windows and fallen chimneys, as if by shot and shell. One of the 40 female inmates at the Bethesda Penitentiary on Dublin's north side took the opportunity to light a fire that destroyed the building as well as the surrounding houses, schoolhouse and chapel. 2 firemen died trying to extinguish the flames. The hurricane did not stop in Dublin. It pounded its way across the Irish Sea, killing hundreds of luckless souls caught at sea. It killed nearly 100 fishermen off the coast of Skerries. It killed Captain Smith and the 30 people on board the packet ship Pennsylvania. Ships all along the west coast of England were wrecked. Dead bodies continued to wash up on shore for weeks afterwards. At Everton, the same wind unroofed a cotton factory that whitened all the space for miles around, as if there had been a heavy fall of snow. Estimates as to how many died that night vary from 300 to 800, a remarkably low figure given the ferocity of the storm. Many must have succumbed to pneumonia, frostbite, or depression in its wake. Those bankrupted by the disaster included hundreds who had stashed their life savings up chimneys and in the thatched roofs that disappeared in the night. Even in those days it was an ill wind that turned none to good, and among those to benefit were the builders, carpenters, slaters, and thatchers who subsequently rebuilt the fallen buildings. The big wind also inspired the Reverend Romney Robinson of the Armagh Observatory to invent the Robinson Cup anemometer, which was to be the standard instrument for gauging wind speed for the rest of the 19th century. There were tremendous tales of heroism too. As daylight began to break across Lough Swilly, Lieutenant John Holland, the head Coast Guard at Rathmullen, became aware of the fate of the stricken schooner Venus, whose master and crew were still clinging to the rigging for dead life. He rounded up 6 brave men and put out in a boat, reaching the ship at about 9 o'clock in the morning. They managed to rescue all 9 men, for which Lieutenant Holland was awarded a silver medal. Perhaps the most unlikely beneficiaries of the night of the big wind were those old enough to remember it when the Old Age Pensions Act was enacted in January 1909, 70 years after the event. The Act, which offered the first ever weekly pension to those over the age of 70, was likened to the opening of a new factory on the outskirts of every town and village in Britain and Ireland. By March 1909, over 80,000 British pensioners were registered, of whom 70,000 were Irish. When a committee was sent to investigate this imbalance, it transpired that few births in Ireland were registered before 1865. As such, the Irish Pensions Committee decreed that if someone's age had gone astray on them, they would be eligible for a pension if they could state that they were fine and hearty on the night of the big wind, or the Ihe na Gwiha Mura, as it's called in Irish. One such applicant was Tim Joyce of County Limerick. "I always thought I was 60, he explained. "But me friends came to me and told me they were certain sure I was 70, and if there were 3 or 4 of them against me, the evidence was too strong for me. I put in for the pension and got it." But we're not finished with the storm just yet, for the north of Ireland suffered just as badly. This extract from the late storm from the Northern Standard, dated Saturday, January 12th, 1839. Read by David McGlynn, a.k.a. the Squire.
On the night of Sunday last, the severe storm which ravaged the kingdom was felt severely in the town of Monaghan. About 11:30 the gale, which had been gradually increasing for some time, swelled into a most terrific hurricane, and about 3 a.m. on Monday morning, the power of air rushing from the southwest bore everything before it with resistless force. The slates and roofing of several houses were borne upon the raging element as if they were leaves upon the breeze, and the cowering and terrified inhabitants looked on the devastation with arms palsied with fear, and in trembling awe looked to the almighty dispenser of all things for an abatement of the fury of the winds of heaven. A fire burst forth from the chimney of Mr. John Murray's church square, and the sparks and flame were dashed upon the roofs of several thatched houses which occupy one side of the diamond. For upwards of 1 hour the flue, which we believe had not been swept for a length of time, threw forth masses of fire which were hurled by the tempest to a great distance and occasioned much additional alarm, but thank God no more evil result followed. The fire burnt itself out, and the roofs of the houses on which the sparks had fallen were so saturated with wet from the rain and snow which had fallen on the previous days that they were immediately extinguished. However, several dwellings present to the view a frightful wreck. Many chimneys were wrecked, and we regret to say that 3 of the small spires which ornamented our beautiful church were thrown from their bases and broken to pieces. The amount of damage done in the neighbourhood is enormous. The farmyards are a melancholy spectacle. Hay, straw, oats, wheat and barley have been in almost every instance heaped together in dreadful confusion. Turf ricks have been tossed to a distance scarcely credible, and much of the fine old timber which graced the domains of the nobility and gentry of the neighbourhood had been torn up by the roots. The beautiful plantation in the domain of Mrs. Leslie of Glaslock has suffered to a great extent, and the residence of Mr. Edward Lucas, Esquire, of Castleshane, MP, has severely felt the force of the storm. The memory of the oldest inhabitants of this country cannot furnish us an instance of such devastation in so limited a period. And not to storm alone are many of the injuries attributed. Fire has, in sundry places, lent its aid to the terrible destruction. In Glaslock, a small town within 5 miles of Monaghan, 8 houses were burned to the ground, and their inhabitants driven houseless into the streets. But it affords no pleasure, amidst the recital of such calamity, to be able to state that no human being was deprived in life. In Killilea, between Glaslock and Armagh, great havoc has been committed by the combined elements of destruction. The town of Clones, from its elevated position, felt the full force of the tempest, and Ballybay, Castleblaney and Carrickmacross have had many houses rendered untenantable. Several carts laden with pork, etc., coming from the direction of Clones to our market on Monday, were compelled to return, in consequence of the numerous impediments of the roads caused by fallen trees.
And again, my sincere thanks to Turtle Bunbury, that most accomplished Irish historian and author, for his help on that piece.
Not paranormal. Mark Manning is real. Now that's a scary thought.
Now, if you don't know about the Rendlesham Forest incident in 1980 in England, where on a US airbase, apparently UFOs appeared, this is all well documented, folks. If you don't know about that, don't consider yourself part of the paranormal community. But I'm sure you do. What I was amazed to find out recently as I was narrating a documentary on Rendlesham Forest was that allegedly, there were hieroglyphics on the side of the UFO. I don't know if they photographed them or what, but years later they were analysed, and apparently they represented two coordinates. One was for the pyramids of Giza, and another for a lesser-known place called Hy-Brasil, or Hy-Brasil, off the northwest coast of Ireland. It's mythical, shrouded in mystery it is, supposedly a kind of an Atlantis that sunk under the waves and used to reappear every, 7 years, something like that. David McGlynn, a.k.a. the Squire, is now going to relate a story all about it, and your children might like to listen in on this one.
The god of the sea, Manannán mac Lir, rode his horse Enbar across the ocean. The scales on the god's skin rippled over his taut muscles, his hair flowing behind him like a cape, and his sword, Ansara, hanging by his side. He smiled at the sight of a cloud of fog ahead. To the unsuspecting human eye, this was nothing unusual, but Manannán knew one of his phantom islands lay hidden inside. Unlike his other secret abodes, this one was dangerously close to land, and, if discovered by humans, would be ruined forever. Luckily, it was always cloaked in fog, except for one day every 7 years, when it became visible to human eyes. And that day was getting close. That's why he'd been summoned to the island now. He emerged through the fog onto a golden beach, behind which the spires of a magnificent city rose into the clouds. Some of the other gods were waiting for him on the sand, their faces grim with concern. "If gods can't be happy," laughed Manannán, jumping off his horse, "what hope is there for mere mortals?" "It is the mere mortals we are worried about," said the Dagda, god of weather, crops, and the seasons. When he planted his staff in the sand, a crow landed on it. "What do you mean?" asked Manannán. The Dagda looked at the bird. "Tell him, my love." The crow hopped down onto the sand, instantly transforming into a woman, the Morrigan, goddess of war. "The humans know when our island will appear," she said. "They wait in their ships. We must stop them." The Dagda put his hand on his wife's shoulder. "We cannot expose ourselves." "Well, we must do something," she said angrily. The gods all looked to Manannán, because he was the only one who moved easily between the world of gods and the world of men. "Leave it to me," he said, leading Enbar across the sand to his palace. Inside, he swapped his godly robes for human clothes, and closing his eyes, he transformed his body too. His opalescent scales fell away to reveal human skin. The gills on the either side of his neck sealed themselves shut, and the webbed skin between his fingers and toes disappeared. He had entered his palace as a god and left it as a human. His alter ego, Orbson Macalid. Mounting his horse, he rode off across the waves, and soon arrived at mainland Ireland, where, as the Morrigan had said, a fleet of ships waited for the island to show itself. Using his magic, Manannán veiled himself in fog and landed unseen on the humans' beach, where a large crowd had gathered. As he approached, the people parted to make way for him, even the king's soldiers, who knew by the rider's horse and clothing that he was a man of some importance. Arriving before the human king, Manannán dismounted his horse, got down on one knee, and introduced himself as Orbson Macalid, merchant trader and nobleman. "I am Bressil," said the king. "How can I help you?" Manannán smiled. "I think you will find that it is I who can help you." Bressil arched his eyebrows. "I believe you are waiting to conquer the ghostly island known as the Isle of the Blessed," continued Manannán. The king nodded with interest, for it wasn't often he met someone who knew anything about the mysterious island. "You know the island only appears for one day," said Manannán. "A day is all it will take to seize it," said the king. Manannán shook his head in disagreement. "By nightfall the island will have sunk beneath the waves and you will all be drowned." "That is not what I have heard, Orbson Macalid. I have heard that if we land there, we will live forever in a realm of plenty among the gods." The thought of an army of humans on his precious island paradise made Manannan's human skin crawl. He could tell the king wasn't going to be put off his quest though, so Manannan came up with another plan to prevent an invasion. "There is one way to stop the island from submerging beneath the water," he said. "Oh really?" said the king. "What is that?" "Each of its 4 corners must be pinned down with a metal spear," said Manannan. "If this is done before midnight, the island will remain solid for you to conquer and stay." "That sounds easy," said Brazel. "Not so," replied Manannan. "You have but 1 day to reach all 4 corners." The king thought about this for a moment and then ordered his men to prepare 4 spears and send for the 4 fastest runners in his city of the tribes. It was night by the time they returned with 3 athletes, 2 men and a woman. The first was Manus, the finest hunter in the land. It was said that he couldn't pass a deer without bringing it down. The second was Macda, a musician who collected songs from all over Ireland. The third was Sela, a woman whose speed was only surpassed by her knowledge and love of nature, particularly flowers. "But that is only 3, said the king. "We couldn't find a 4th, said one of his soldiers. "I will go," said a lone voice from the crowd. Everybody turned to see the king's daughter, Galia, step forward. King Brazel grasped her hands and shook his head. "I cannot let you go, my dear princess. It is too dangerous." "I want to go, father," she replied. "I'm a fast runner, and I want to claim this island in your name." As always, the princess got what she wanted, and in the end her father agreed. The 4 runners were given metal spears and put aboard a boat, manned by 20 rowers, to wait for the island to appear. As the first rays of morning sun splashed orange across the dark horizon, the phantom island started to appear through the mist like a mirage on the water. Distant hilltops and city spires materialized before the waiting rowers' eyes, spurring them into action, their muscled arms moving in unison to cut their boat through the waves. As soon as the craft made landfall on the elusive island, the 4 runners took off, sprinting in different directions, their spears perfectly balanced by their sides. Manus bounded across the soft sand and cleared the grassy dunes in a few strides, to enter a forest on the other side. He raced through the trees, treading so lightly that he barely broke a twig. At midday he stopped to rest and drink from a small brook. As he was catching his breath, he noticed movement in the trees and squinted his eyes to see more clearly in the gloom. A magnificent stag ambled through the trees, unaware of his presence. Manus had taken down many a stag in his days, but never one of this size or species. He knew he shouldn't let himself get distracted from his task, but he couldn't resist the thrill of the hunt. "It'll only delay me a few moments," he thought, raising his spear above his shoulder. He began to tiptoe towards his prey, but the stag seemed to have better senses than the deer he usually hunted, because alerted to his presence, the animal took off at speed. Manus gave chase, following the creature out of the forest, across hillsides, and over gurgling streams. Whenever he accelerated to get closer, the deer increased its pace, and never allowed Manus to get close enough to throw his spear. He knew he should abandon his pursuit, but he couldn't, and as the evening sky started to darken, he knew he had failed the king. Meanwhile, Macda was gaining good ground across grassland full of grazing cattle, the likes of which he had never seen before. They were twice the size of normal cows, and were weighed down with others, each full enough to feed a small village. As he was crossing a ditch from one field to the next, he heard the most magical music. Now Macda knew almost every tune in Ireland, but he'd never heard anything like this before. It seemed to be played by some alien instrument, and though he knew he shouldn't get distracted from his mission, he couldn't resist the spellbinding melody. He followed it from field to field and towards mountains that rose out of the horizon like shards of broken flint. He knew he should abandon his foolish diversion, but every step seemed to bring him closer and closer to the music. By the time he reached the foothills of the mountains, the tune was so loud in his ears that it seemed inevitable that he would reach its source, and yet he never did. Sheila had almost arrived at her corner of the island when she came across a garden of flowers so exotic and mesmerizing that she had to stop. Though she considered herself an expert in the field of botany, she couldn't identify any of the flowers in this garden. She soon lost track of time, moving from species to species, marveling at their opalescent scents and vibrant colours. Only when it became too dark to see did she stop, realizing then that she had failed in her errand for the king. It was as if the island had put the garden in her path to distract her. Galia, the king's daughter, was not sidetracked by wild animals, enchanted tunes, or outlandish flowers, for there was only one thing she loved, her father, Brasil, and she was determined to do him proud. She ran all day without stopping and reached the furthestmost corner of the island as the evening sun sank in the sky. Taking a ragged breath, she planted the spear deep into the ground before collapsing in exhaustion, hoping her fellow runners had succeeded too. As darkness descended, Galia fell into a deep sleep, dreaming of welcoming her father to these hallowed shores in the morning. She didn't know that Manas, Magda and Sheila had failed to pin down their corners of the island, and now it was sinking slowly into the sea, not to return for another 7 years. Beach, grassland, cows, forest, city, and eventually mountains descended beneath the waves. Poor Galia didn't even wake as the water lapped around her, taking her into its cold embrace. For she was dreaming she was in paradise, and, in a way, she was. It just wasn't the island paradise her father dreamed of, but one where her soul would join those of her ancestors in a land of gods. King Brasil and his people waited on the mainland for the morning to arrive, but the sun's first beams didn't illuminate the fabled island as they had hoped, but only the wide, empty sea, vast, cold, and heartless as always. The king cried for what he had lost, and it wasn't an island. Saddened too at the loss of 4 young lives, Orbson MacAlid slipped quietly away to find his horse to return to his island, which was safe for another few years at least. Some people say the island was later named Island of Brasil after the king who tried to capture it. They got shortened to Hy-Brasil in Old Irish. E is sometimes written as Hy, so the name eventually became Hy-Brasil, the Island of Brasil. The city of the tribes was named after his daughter, Galia, which is the Irish word for Galway, and Loch Corrib, whose river flows through the city, was called Loch Orbson after Manannán mac Lir's pseudonym. Over time, the lake became known as Loch Orib, and eventually Loch Corrib, as we know it today. For a long time, Hy-Brasil was believed to have been a real place. It is included on countless maps of Ireland from as early as 1325 to as recently as 1865.
Certainly hoped you enjoyed hearing all about Hy-Brasil, children. And that was an excerpt from Ciarán Fanning's Haunted Ireland, an atlas for every county in Ireland of ghost stories. And indeed, Ciarán joined us here a few weeks back as well. Oh, you'll get it in all good bookstores and online as well.
Mark Manning.
Oh, that would be me going out with a bang, don't you know? So listen. Like and subscribe, do whatever you can to stay in touch. I'd really love to hear from you. If you have any Irish-related ghost stories, let's be having them. Indeed, they don't have to be, because we do welcome a little international interlude right here on Scary Era all the time. So send me those stories to paranormalireland@protonmail.com. That's it. Take care, 'cause I care.
Scary Era is a Mark Manning media production in association with Paranormal Radio UK.